Today we're going to talk about how likely you are to draw the card you want in Gwent with some math, right? The recent changes to many of the thinning cards, all of them are basically going to 4 provisions, except the ones that have some big upside. So with all those changes, I wanted to take a look at how good thinning was and how good these changes are. And to do that, I first want to look at how likely you are to draw stuff. So we're going to talk about the probability of drawing a specific card you want in each round, then also try and figure out how good thinning is, that'll be its own video. So we're going to split this in 2 parts. First part is the chance we draw a specific card by certain points in the game. This is like the deck building part, like if you put in 1 tutor, how likely are you to see your card like round 2, for example. And the second part, we're going to look at if you're in a game, so you've already started the game, you haven't drawn your card yet, so you started the game, you're in round 1, you don't have your card. How likely are you to get it round 2? How likely are you to get it by the end of the game? This is important for trying to decide how you're playing out the game. Should you count on drawing it or not? That type of thing. And yeah, that's what we're going to do in the second part. And I want to say here, I'm actually re-recording this since Lerio did a fantastic article on the same topic while I was in the process of making this. If you want to see more details and deeper analysis on some of the things in this, make sure to check it out. He talks about the value of tutors, like the point value, and does an analysis how many tutors to run and when not to run them, which is really nice. If you've already read his article, the second part we're talking about the likelihood of drawing cards at certain points if you're already in the game. I don't think he talked about, and I don't think he talked about scroll, which is something we're going to talk about too. Curse scroll is a pretty interesting case. So let's start with round 1, which is basically a chance to open a specific card. And the first and easiest thing here is just talk about chance of drawing it. So it's not too complicated. We want to determine how often we see the specific card, a success within our deck, population, you know where this is going, go with statistics. Without replacement, so we keep the cards we draw in our hand. We're going to be using a hypergeometric distribution. Nothing too complex. We're not going to do any choose functions or anything. We're just going to let the hypergeometric function within Excel do it for us. And then apply some math to it, because we have to do different things considering different rounds. But yeah, since we don't when we redraw, we don't put the card back for our next redraw. So like if you redraw a card, put it back, you can't redraw it that same round. You used to be able to, which thankfully they took away for my sanity as well as this calculation. But yeah, so that's not that important. So like for round 1, we can say there's 13 cards seen, and then that's fine. So if you're just interested in the results, feel free to use the chapters. So I'm going to go through what I did here, just so you guys can see. And I just felt like it. Bit of a completionist sometimes. So to begin with, we want to know what's the chance we see the card in our opening hand. It's important for decks like Generator, one of my favorite decks for sure. We have 10 cards opening hand, and then if you go first or second, you get 2 or 3 redraws, depending. And that says you have a 50% chance to win first or second. In theory, we all know how that actually works out. You can either go first with 3 redraws or go second with 2. So you can see what I did here. We just made a separate column for each one. These are just the inputs for the formula I made. Nothing too complicated. And none of this is really too important. Let's take a look at the results over here. So with 10 cards and 3 redraws going first, you got a 52% chance to see that one card you want. That's not that bad. If you go second, this is with no tutors, by the way, you got a 48% for an overall 50. So like what you do here, this is more probability, right? So you got a 50% chance going first, so 0.5 times this, and you have a 50% chance going second, so 0.5 times this. Add them up, subtract the product of both happening. You apply the logic here. You can't go first and second. They're mutually exclusive. So the probability of both is 0. So multiply them. Get this. Nothing too complicated. I'm going to do this first and second thing for all the calculations, then just talk about the overall most of the time. Because I think the overall is like a good summary. Like obviously if you go first, you have a slightly better chance. Second, slightly worse. We're talking about the overall percentage for most of these. I just wanted to mention we're doing this. And it comes out to a nice, neat 50% chance to see your card that you want to be your opener. If you go, if you make in your deck, you have 50% chance to open your specific card. Pretty convenient, actually. So yeah. What if we add a tutor to the deck, though? So we'll go up here. But tutors, the max thing is just because I only made 5 rows. So we change this. We can see we did some different maths. What we did essentially here is we changed the number of successes in our deck. It's in the formula here, right? We've got 2 successes now. 1 success is the card, 1 success is the tutor. We don't care if we get both. We just want to know if we get at least 1. So at least 1 is just these added together. I separated them all out by the number because I was looking at card combos, but I don't know if I'm going to do that anymore since Lerio already talked about it and it's extremely complicated. compared to this. Because you have to account for stuff like, did you draw 1 in round 1 and 1 in round 2? Because if so, the round 2 deck size or successes in the deck changes, and it was really complicated. So if you already did it, I might not. So you can see here we got a pretty good chance. It goes up to 76% chance overall. If you have 1 tutor, see your opening card or a specific card round 1 that you tutor. That's a pretty big improvement, right? Like 50% to 76. That's pretty good. And I think that's a good example of just how good having even just 1 tutor in your deck is. And it's very impactful. And I want to mention here, before we get too far in this, that playing a tutor does thin your deck, right? And we're not talking about thinning that yet. We'll do that in its own video. But that doesn't matter for this case, because if we tutor the card, we've already met our conditions of being successful by having access to the specific card. So it doesn't matter that the deck size went down by 1 in this case. We're talking about thinning on its own. We'll talk about that in its own video, but there it will matter. So, what if we go up to 2 tutors? Now this is probably the most you're going to see in most decks, but say you run like World of Decree Whispering Hillock is the one example I can think of that I've seen pretty consistently. There's also like Oniromancy and Amphibious Assault for some Northern Realms decks, or Decree and Amphibious Assault. Or it could be cool and run Knighthood and Amphibious Assault. Anyway, so say you're going to play the 2 tutors, and we can see that the chance of getting your card in round 1 goes all the way up to 89%. That's actually really good. And I should mention here, when we have these copies and tutors, obviously if you're playing a bronze card, it's the same as if we just had like, this is this 1 card and 2 tutors is the same as 2 cards and 1 tutor. So you can kind of go back and take a look at the math like that if you want to. Obviously the copies max is because, well, you can't have more than 2. And like I was saying though, this 89% is actually really good. 8 out of the 9 that's 8 out of 9 games you'll probably have your card. That is quite nice. Well, if we go to 3 tutors, I wouldn't recommend playing 3 tutors really in anything. But if you were going to, it increases the chance of you opening with your specific card to just over 95%. That is really, really consistent. But the provisions is the big pain there. We're still like having the chance, right? Better than having our chance of missing our card, which is good. But I was gonna do an analysis on just how good this stuff is with the points and provisions compared to like tutors versus cards. But Lerio already did a good discussion of that, so I don't think I will anymore. But yeah, this, if you got 3 tutors, say you're playing a deck that really needs a specific opening card. Not sure what would play this, but you could, and this is what would happen. But anyway, let's go back to just old 0 tutors, good old case here, and we're gonna go down and talk about Cursed Scroll real quick before we talk about something else. So Cursed Scroll is weird. I want to give it its own little section because Cursed Scroll is a very interesting card. So, a little stratagem, I should say. It lets you draw a card of your choice and place a card from your hand in the bottom of your deck. We're only going to talk about the draw effect right now, but we'll revisit the bottom of the deck part when we talk about thinning in the thinning video later, because that is pretty relevant too. So you have 50% chance to go first. I know, once again, we know how that 50% really pans out. Whenever you want to go first, you go second. But anyway, if you're running the scroll, you have a 50% chance to have it, and that means you have essentially a 50% chance to have a 100% chance to have your card, because scroll will always mean you have access to the card you want. And the best thing about scroll is it draws the card, so you don't have to play the card in that round. You could draw your Renfrey and then save it for round 2, for example. So if that wasn't the case, this would be different, but as it is, it always gives you access to the card throughout the game. So we want to combine this with the probability we already calculated, basically. We have an or, the chance of going first and having scroll. That's one way to get the card we want round 1. The other way would be to go second and draw the card. So we have to do the math there. And it comes out to just slightly worse than that 1 tutor case, right? So if we go first, you got 100% chance to get the card, access to the 1 card. 0% chance to have no access to it, because I think you can actually Heatwave Cursed Scroll, but I don't think anyone would ever do that. So we're just going to pretend like it. I've never seen that, so. Got the 100%. No, we don't want to replace anything. 100% going first. So in second, it's the 48% for chance for earlier. I wanted to mention this specific example here because it is a time where the overall is going to change a little bit because of this. We can't just use the 50-50 from before, because That 50-50 was considering the going first being slightly better than the going second for consistency purposes, so we gotta use the going second here. And that means we end up with a 74% chance overall. So, like I said, it's pretty close to the one tutor earlier, but it's just a little bit worse. So if we take a look at another example here, this is one I want to mention because this is one I do in quite a few decks. So you play one tutor, you go down to first scroll here. So we got the 100% going first, right? We got our 74% going second. And that's just the sum of this column of the 1 or the 2, because you could have access to both of the cards if you're playing a tutor. There's an overall 87%, right? So we got a 50% chance going first, 0.5 times 100 is 50%. 50% chance going second, 0.5 times this is 0.37, 37%, add them up, get 87. So that's the one I used in quite a few decks actually. It's just a little bit less than 7 out of 8 games. That is pretty good, and you save the provisions on the second tutor card, which is why Scroll is really nice for decks that want to open a card. Sassia Commander is the one I always go to, so I do in Harmony. So that is worth mentioning for sure. But there are some downsides to Scroll, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but let's go back for now to drawing a card by the end of the game instead of round 1. So we already did round 1, talked about it. I'm just going to put this back down to 0 tutors here for a second. And if we take a look here, go to round 2. Let's say we're going to go through round 2 and round 3 because we want to know by the end of the game. Let's say you want to find your scenario, for example, by the end of the game. As people who play scenario decks know, if you don't see your scenario by the end of the game, you feel pretty bad. So we want to know how likely that is, and do we need like 2 tutors for that, for example, for it to be consistent enough. So we went through the round 1 math. That's all fine. But now we want to figure out the chances for round 2 and 3. So once again, we have a new deck essentially in round 2. We draw 3 cards with 2 mulligans, so we see 5 cards. So we draw 5 out of a deck size of 15 now. If you thin the deck, this is a big thing where thinning matters. This changes, but we'll talk about that in its own video. The trends will be the same, and thinning might not have as big of an effect as you think it does, but we'll just take a look at this for now. We'll talk about the thinning and how much better it makes it in its own video. So that's what we've got going on here, and as you can see, probably no surprise, you got a 33% chance, 5 out of 15, basically for this. However, and one thing I do want to mention here, by the way, is once you're in round 2, going first or second doesn't affect it as much anymore, right? Like these are the same, right? Because going first or second, the same redraws now. The way the first or second affects it is it carries over from the round 1 stuff. Speaking about the round 1 stuff, we now know we have this is the round 1 chance to get our card. First, second, overall. Let's mostly look at the overall here. So to figure out the total chance here, we want to do is have an or. We can be happy if we drew the card round 1, which is this 50%, or we draw it round 2 and didn't get it round 1. So got it round 1, we're already happy, don't care. So the chance we got it round 1, 50%, plus the chance we didn't get it round, or chance we got it round 1, 50%, yeah, the chance we didn't get it this round 2, we take that here, 67%, multiply that by the chance I meant the round 1, no, right? 50% we didn't get it round 1, and then we multiply that by the chance we then get it now, and that gives us our answer, right? So 67% chance that by round 2 you get your card. And then not surprisingly for round 3 we just do the same thing. Just a little wider for a second here. So basically the same thing here. We're down to 12 cards in deck now because we drew 3 more. Still see 5, so the chance goes up to see your card because the deck size is smaller. Makes sense. We had this chance from before, the round 1 plus 2 yes, round 1 plus 2 no. We got calculated that just before. And then to figure out the total yes, we get our chance if we drew it round 1 or 2, which we calculated. And then we'd have to draw it not in round 2, that's the one side of the ors if this happened, or we didn't draw it in both of those. There's this percent chance, which is oddly convenient number, and then you multiply that by this, and we get our 80.5% approximately. They get it by the end of the game. That's just what we went through and did. I went through and did this for a bunch of different tutor numbers. I went through and did it for scroll, same idea. Basically the same idea for scroll, other than round 1 being a little different because of the whole scroll thing. So what I did is I took all those results and I put them in a little table for us to take a look at. And let's there's some interesting stuff here that I definitely want to talk about. So if you run no tutors, like we just talked about when we went through the example, right? If you run no tutors, the chance you see your specific card is 80.5%, just about 80%. So it's like 1 out of 2 by round 1, 2 out of 3 by round 2, 4 out of 5 by round 3. I wouldn't really count on that for like a gold card in your deck, say scenario, but for things like tech cards, say you want your spores. Spores is a good example. So you have a spores in your deck. You don't want to tutor the spores, but you're playing a deck that goes tall. What's the chance that you'll draw that spores in a game where you want it, right? It's like 80%. It's pretty, in that manner, it's pretty decent for tech cards. So that's interesting to note. And that's for like one of tech cards that are bronzes, or just any gold. Say you have a gold you don't want to tutor. Say you're playing Gerd in your deck, and you're playing against Arrakis Swarm, but you don't want to tutor the Gerd. In a case where you go up against Arrakis Swarm, you got about an 80% chance to get that Gerd. So that's interesting. But I think the biggest thing here is we take a look at the consistency from adding one tutor card. So copies including tutors, we go from 1 instead to 2. So we have 1 tutor and 1 copy of our card now. Look at the benefit 1 tutor gives you. Round 1, 76% versus 50. That's a big jump. Round 2, you're almost at 90%. Let's call it 90%. 90% chance. I only had the decimal points out this far because it was rounding all these to 100. I wanted to make them look different. But yeah, so 90% approximately round 2 that you get access to your card versus 67. That's a big one. 9 out of 10 times you get your card round 2. You're playing a scenario deck. You're playing like Oneiromancy plus scenario. You've got that chance to have that scenario round 2 for like a round 2 push or 2-0 attempt if your opponent didn't draw well, you don't think. 9 out of 10 times. That's pretty good. But the real big one here is if you have 1 tutor card and 1 card you want to see in your deck, say you're playing like scenario and you have an Avlok Sage, for example. We won't use Oneiromancy in this case because it has Echo. Yeah, you've got a 97% chance of access to that by round 3. That is really good. So why people say Gwent's a really consistent game. This is part of the reason why, right? You have a really good chance of, even if there's 1 tutor card, finding the cards you want 97% of the time. That is really good. And this is also just a chance you have a bronze. Like, say you're playing 2 copies of a bronze. Say you're playing Arrakis Swarm and you're running 2 spores, right? Because it's an organic.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
You've got a 97% chance to draw one of those spores by the end of the game, which probably means you don't need to tutor for it. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. One more thing I want to mention here is if we take a look at the 2 tutors, so 3 effective copies here, you're looking at an almost insane amount of consistency, right? We talked about this 89% earlier. That's really good. Chance by round 2 is at 97% though. Like, if you're running 2 tutors, say Oneiromancy and Decree for some deck, let's say you're playing Self Wound and you want to draw your Sigvald, right? Play your Sigvald round 2, then play it round 3 again via some kind of revive effect. You have a 97% chance of having that round 2 if you have 2 tutors in your deck. That's really good. Like that is extremely consistent. And by round 3, you're looking at 99.5% if you're playing 3 tutors. This is where you had to add decimal points because it's rounding it to 100. So if you're playing like 200 games, you see it 199 times. In theory, with 2 tutors. 2 tutors is incredibly consistent. Although, to be fair, this also gives you a pretty good reason to complain when you're playing 2 tutors and you don't draw any of them or your card by the end of the game, which feels really bad. That's how math or RNG works, though. So the thing I want to mention here is, like, we talked about this. This is really good, right? But the only time 2 tutors doesn't really give you a super high chance is at round 1, right? Like, 89% is not quite as good if you're just in round 1. But I think the only time that matters that you get more than this percent is you're playing some kind of all-in deck. So, say you're playing triple Bloody Mistress, which is Sabbath, for example, where you have to open the Bloody Mistress and Arrakis Queen, those type of cards. Then is the only time you really want more tutors. But if you're going to try and do that round 1, you actually don't. 89% might not be enough for that deck. But other than that, like, round 1's the only one where you're not super guaranteed to see your stuff with 2 tutors. And then I think we'll go take a look at scroll, because that's the next table just down here, and we'll do a little bit of comparison, because scroll is interesting. I'm not going to talk about everything with scroll, especially these later counts over here, just because no one really plays this many tutors. I just put in here because I did the math anyway. But we'll just take a look at the scroll here, because let's take a look at round 1. This is the big one here. So how do you compare scroll to another tutor card, right? So say you were playing a tutor card in your deck, how good is it to add scroll versus a second tutor card? That's the big deal, right? Well, if you're playing no tutors in your deck, obviously scroll is way better. However, let's say you're playing a deck, no tutors, and you just run scroll. How does that compare to just having one tutor? Well, in round 1, got that 76% we talked about for the tutor and your copy, 2 effective copies to get your card. With scroll round 1, you got a 74% chance. However, this feels a lot more polarizing than it is, because you either have the scroll or you don't, right? Like you either go first or second. And if you're going first, you already know that you have it. If you go second, that chance is 48%. It's pretty low. But overall, when you're deck building, if you were just to run no tutors and a scroll, you got about a 74% chance. However, that's really not good for a deck. We'll talk about that later, why this isn't very good. But I want to skip over to a second to round 2. We used this 87% example during the calculations. This is the one I said I do for like Harmony and a couple other decks actually. So if you have scroll and 1 tutor, it's 87% chance to open your card. If you have 2 tutors, so you have to pay for that extra tutor, you're getting an 89%. You can see here just how close these are, right? This is 7 out of 8, this is 8 out of 9. It's like a 2% difference between scroll and the extra tutor card. You don't have to pay the provisions for it. This is why the scroll is such a good consideration for decks that want an opener card, specifically. Like you want to always tutor an opener card. Scroll is really good for that if you want to add it to your deck. However, there is a downside to scroll. And let's just take a look at round 2 and 3 compared to the other ones. So why does this go down so much? So if we just use this first example here, why you don't play scroll with no tutors, is even though this round 1's really close, look at the round 2. You go from 90% chance to see your card round 2 with a tutor to 83% if you just have scroll. Right, that is that's a pretty big drop. That's a pretty big drop. And then if you look at round 3, you look at 97% like we talked about with a tutor to just 90%. Again, that's like a 7% drop. That's why the scroll really falls off after round 1, right? Because if you don't draw your card round 1 with a tutor in your deck, you've got 2 successes in your deck, so you've still got the tutor and you still got the card. If you don't draw it round 1 because you didn't get scroll, you don't have a tutor in your deck, and you're only looking at drawing that 1 success, the 1 copy of the card. Which is why no one ever runs scroll without a tutor in their deck, because you're really missing out on that round 3 chance and round 2 chance of getting your card. If we look at the next column though, like if we take a look at here, so you're running 1 tutor and scroll, this is something a lot of people do. The difference here is, yeah, the round 1 still slightly worse. The round 2, 97% chance for a second tutor, 94 with the scroll. That's still a reasonable drop, right? Like that's what, like 3%, 2.5%. It's not that bad. It's because you have the extra tutor. Like, the difference between having 2 copies in your deck when you're redrawing in round 2 and 3 and 1 copy, which we had here, is really big. That's just what this comes down to. And then, like, in the game, you got 98% here, 98.2 compared to the 99.5 from 2 tutors. This is usually good enough, right? Like 1 scroll and 1 tutor is usually good enough. This is even higher. The big benefit from the scroll comes in that round 1 most of the time. Right, you can see that the scroll adds like an 11% chance of getting your card compared to not having it. And it's very similar to extra tutor, which I thought was really interesting. I thought this was really cool. I don't know if you guys think it's lame or not, but I thought that was cool. So now we talked about scroll, we talked about this. One thing I really want to talk about, which we didn't do yet, and one thing I don't think Lerio mentioned at all, is if you're in the game already, what's your chance of getting the card you're missing? So this is the last part we talked about, like this, with the chance of drawing your stuff, using scroll or not. This is all really important when you're deck building, right? Like, say you're building a deck, you want to know how often you are to get your cards. If you have some card you want to play every game, how likely is it? That type of thing. This is all very useful for that. What we want to talk about now is if you're already in a game and you don't have your card, how likely are you to get it? So this affects your decisions in the game, right? So let's take a look at it, because I thought this was the most interesting thing to me, other than the whole scroll thing being really good round 1. So I calculated this, parts of this were in the other calculation, right? Like we knew the chance to draw, say at the start of round 2, start of round 3, right? We did that separately. I just combined all the calculations, did a little OR, math and stuff, and we ended up with this table down here. So if you haven't drawn your card yet, how likely are you to get it? So this was really interesting to me. So say you're in round 1, right? You're in round 1, you don't have your card. You don't play a tutor, you don't have your card. A chance you draw it in your draws for round 2, those 3 cards and 2 redraws, is only 33%. That's actually rather unlikely. If you're in round 2, you got like a 42% chance to see it in round 3's draws. But at that point, you're like, that's still only like a 2 out of 5. That's not very good. And the one that shocked me the most, really, and then if I thought about it, it made sense, is if you're in round 1 and you don't have your card, you only have a 61% chance to see it by the end of the game. This doesn't really matter much for deck building, because the 97% chance or whatever, these chances up here apply to this when you're deck building. But when you're in the game, if you already don't have the card, your chances of getting it in like the next round aren't that great, which might impact how you think about stuff in the game. We'll talk about some examples where this really gets important, but first I want to talk about the one tutor example, because this is really the common one. Oh, and I do want to mention here that for this, scroll versus no scroll does not matter, because these both are situations where you don't have access to the card round 1, right? So I said this down here. It's the same. If we're in round 1, we already have this, and we don't have our card yet, it means we didn't get the scroll. And in that case, all the math is the same, because scroll only takes effect really in the round 1. So if you're in round 1, you got your one tutor in your deck, say your Royal Decree, and you've got your Fuchsia in your deck still. Like, you want to have that Fuchsia by the end of the game, you want to get that Royal Decree, you want to get one of them so you can play the Fuchsia on your Ryogan. Just an example. If you're in round 1, you got a 57% chance to draw them in round 2. That's not that much better than a coin flip, but it's better. If you're in round 2, the chance goes up pretty significantly in round 3's draws, because we got twice as many successes as the other case here, and where the deck size is smaller. If you're in round 1, by the end of the game, you have an 86% chance. So, like, you didn't open your Fuchsia or your Decree after your mulligans, you've got an 87 or 86% chance that you will get them by the end of the game. However, that is not as guaranteed as you might think when you're building your deck, right? You get a 97% chance to get your card in this situation by the end of round 3 when you're at the deck building stage. But if you've already not drawn it, the chance goes down pretty significantly, which is something to keep in mind, right? Like, especially if you need your card round 2, even with a tutor and your card in your deck, you're just looking at like a 2 out of 3 to get it in round 2. Like, you think you're going to push round 2 and you want to know, am I going to have access to this card? It's not that likely compared to some of the other situations we looked at. So, like, I want to talk about an example here. So let's say let's say your deck's based on a card. Let's say it's based on Renfrey, right? Or a scenario, either one. We'll just talk about Renfrey, I guess, because another one of my favorite cards coming up here. So a fairly common situation where this is really important is that you're in round 1, right? Like, you're in round 1, you're battling it out with the opponent. You can't win round 1, you decide, unless you use your Triss to tutor your Geralt to tall punish the opponent. I'm sure we've all had situations like this where we're like, well, we don't have our Renfrey, we don't have our scenario yet, but if we tutor out this one card, we could win this round. So that's one situation we look at, because this is important. So you have to balance the value of winning that round 1 versus the drop in likelihood of getting your Renfrey or scenario. So with one tutor, let's say Triss in our deck, that's now in our hand, right? We have the Triss with the choice of using her or not. We have one success left in our deck, the Renfrey. So instead of if we were to play the Triss on the Geralt, instead of guaranteeing access to Renfrey, right, we have a 100% chance to access Renfrey, the Triss is in our hand, we drop the chance of seeing the Renfrey from 100% down to 61. That's a big drop, right? Like, you don't, because we're not in this column, even if you're playing the one tutor, if the tutor's in your hand and you use it on something else, you only have the one success in your deck. So that is a pretty painful decision to make. So it's a huge trade-off. You gotta keep that in mind when you're playing the game. So What does all this mean, though, for this part here? We're talking about if you haven't drawn your card yet. Well, there's some interesting things. To me, the things that stood out to me when I looked at this are if you're missing your tutor and your key card after your round 1 redraws, so you're playing Oneiromancy scenario, if you're missing them, you probably shouldn't count on seeing them round 2. It's, like I said, it's 57% chance if you got 1 tutor and 1 copy, which is pretty common for decks, but if you're missing them round 1, probably shouldn't count on it round 2. It's slightly better than half chance you get it, but that's not something I would build my strategy around. Like, say, I wouldn't plan to all in round 1, then draw the scenario, or access to it, and then finish off a 2-0, for example. Like, I wouldn't plan on doing that. But you do have a pretty decent chance. This is about 5 out of 6. You see it by the end of the game. So when you're playing the game, think about that. You might want to plan for that long. Plan for playing round 3, not round 2, because you're more likely to have it if you don't have it yet. This is a reasonable chance you get it. However, let's take this a little further. Let's say you've been playing the game for a little bit. Round 1's over, you're in round 2. What's the chance you're in round 2 that you get your scenario, for example, or your Oneiromancy? This is one that I know I have complained about when it happens to me a lot in videos. We've got Oneiromancy and our scenario. Can we draw them, please? I guess not. You know, why do I even bother playing these cards? In, the last video I made, probably, because it happens all the time, it seems. It seems like it happens all the time when you're playing the game. But, yeah, so we're in round 2. We're missing our Oneiromancy and Gedenieth, because that was the last video I made, was the Alchemy video. So they were missing both of those. What's the chance we get them round 3? If we're in round 2, what's the chance we get them round 3? It's just about 2/3, which is much lower than I expected. This is the one that shocked me the most. So this is something that where if you don't have your cards round 2, you get like a 1 out of 3 chance to miss it. Even if you have a tutor still in your deck and the card you want in your deck, even with 2 successes in your deck, you got a 1/3 chance to miss it if you're in round 2 going to round 3. So there's where you probably want to consider holding on to maybe your second best play or something. So saying that Alchemy deck I was running, instead of saying I want to finish round 3 with the scenario, maybe I hold off, I keep the Otkel, or I keep the Axel 3 Eyes for a tempo play, or I normally push with it round 2. Like, something like that might be worth considering. You do have a pretty decent, like 1 out of 3 is not insignificant chance of missing your cards, even if you're in round 2 with both of them, like the tutor and it left in your deck. So that's kind of interesting. And I know I'm... The next one, there's another point here I should mention. This one I know I'm also guilty of, and this is the biggest one to me, is say you're in a game, and you use your tutor on something other than the card you need by the end of the game. The best one for me here is whenever you play your Royal Decree on a squirrel, for example, because you want to banish the Madoc. Or you play your Royal Decree on the Purified to get rid of the Sirinova's Resilience. So, again, we talked about this a little bit with the Ren, for example. You reduce your chance of seeing the card you want from 100% by having it in your hand. Excuse me, by having the tutor in your hand, I mean. To 61% because you no longer have that tutor in your hand or your deck. And this is one that's important. It's like you have to be really careful when you tutor your tech cards if you're missing the key cards of your deck. Like, the key cards of your deck are usually worth more than the tech cards. There are situations where it's not the case. So you're playing like Alumni versus Madoc Bombs. You really need those Alumni so you get rid of the Madoc so the fire damage doesn't kill off your students after they get hit by the bombs. Might be worth it. But keep in mind how much you're spending by doing that. Like, how much you're reducing the chance of getting your good cards. I know I've done this a few times, and I think it might not be as good of an idea as I thought it was when I did it. Because what happens is you really reduce your chance of getting your cards when you lose the tutor. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the last, well, I guess the second to last thing is, when you miss your, in your opening hand, if you miss your key card, it feels really bad, right? Because like we talked about here, if you're playing a tutor, we'll just keep going with the 1 tutor example because that's the most common one. If you miss your card round 1, these are your chances of getting it by round 2, 3, like in round 1, end of the game. This is round 2, you see it round 3. This one might be a little confusing. I just put it in here because I think it's important sometimes. Your chance gets, if you're deck building, right, you have that you expect 97% of the time to see it. If you're in the game and you don't have it round 1, it goes down quite a bit. So what this means is that the big one here for me is round 2. If you don't open your card, if you're just deck building, you've got 1 tutor, you expect to see your card about 90% of the time. If you're in a game round 1 and you don't have it, and you expect to get pushed, your chance to have it isn't 90% anymore. It's like 68. That's 2 out of 3. Not you. If you're in round 2 and going into round 3, it's this. And say you're in round 1, it's 57. Like, that's not good. Like, if you don't have your card round 1, like I said, you can't. It's not guaranteed you're gonna get it round 2. Like, compared to when you're deck building, like, people say, like, maybe you're in the game, you're like, well, I expect to see this 90% of the time. When I'm deck building, if you're already in the game and you don't have the card, that doesn't apply anymore because you've already passed over the round 1 draws, which makes it go down quite a bit. So just keep in mind, if you're in round 1 or you're in round 2 and don't have the important cards yet, you're much less likely to draw them in the next round. So that's important. And this really, like, leads into the whole thing where it feels really bad to have a bad opening hand. It makes it much, much less likely than, well, at least I expected, to see your best cards if they don't have them in your opening hand, right? I did show this to someone, and they said that means you should just forfeit the game if you draw a bad hand without your tutors. I think that's not the answer, but it does explain, like, why a bad hand feels so bad. Because once you've drawn the bad hand, your chance of, like, fixing it by drawing your good cards, it's pretty low. Especially if your deck's based on 1 card. If your deck's like mid-range with a whole bunch of good gold cards left in it, and you say the success count you want to say is like 7, because you have like 7, 10 provision cards, and you're happy with all of them, not your deck based around a scenario, this is different, then it's different. But we're talking about, like, you need 1 specific card here. Yeah, and as long as we're talking about this, like, one thing to keep in mind is when we remember our situations, remember our bad luck, remember our good luck, people in general remember the bad luck a lot better than the good ones. So I bet you can all think of a couple situations where you got some really bad luck. You didn't draw the cards you needed. You should have drawn it. You really should have drawn it. You play like 3 games in a row with your deck with 1 tutor and you never drew the card. It happens. Like, it's how RNG works, right? And then I bet you probably don't remember the game where you had all of your cards in your opening hand that you wanted. So just keep that in mind. We all know that, although I will mention that we all know the real math here is that if you're missing your key card going to round 3, that chance you draw at 0%. We all know that's the real math. But I'm just doing, like, theoretical here. We know that really it's 0% chance you draw the card you need. You know how it is, guys. Anyway, I want to mention one more thing here is we didn't... I can't capture everything that happens in a game, right? So there's more to the game than just drawing the cards you need. You can play around not having the card. The tutors add flexibility instead of just playing, like, 1 card. Like, say you're not going to play your Fukusha every game with your tutor, right? For example... Sometimes you need a different card. That flexibility is part of why tutors are good. If you want to look more at, like, how much a tutor's worth, I think Lerio did a good job of looking at that, which I didn't. I was going to, but I'm probably not going to anymore since he did it. But maybe in the future. And the last thing is thinning. Thinning will give its own video. We'll talk about this again, how much thinning helps this. But it's just overall the trends are going to be pretty similar, right? And hopefully you guys found this interesting. I thought it was really useful, for myself at least. And if you want more about this type of thing, I'll look at, like, multi-card combos, which I started to do, but it's actually kind of complicated because, unsurprisingly, it matters if you drew half of the combo round 1, because then round 2, the number of successes in your deck change down to 1. It makes the math and stuff rather complicated. I'll have to do that one in MATLAB, I think. But I might not. We'll see. Lerio already talked about it, Lerio, so I don't know if I will. But this whole analysis really made me think about tutoring stuff round 2, for example, when I'm missing my Fukusha. That's the big takeaway for me. So hopefully you found something useful and enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next time. One last note though, guys. This video is the longest effort video of anything I've ever made on the channel. So if you guys liked it or learned something, please let me know in the comments. I would really appreciate it. But like I said, we'll see you next time. That'll be it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. And you can check out some more videos over here. And thanks for watching.